I've owned and lived in the same house for 8 years. It's a pretty standard family-sized home, perfect when I had roommates. But after they moved out, it started to feel too big for just me. It's technically a 4-bedroom house, but I only use 2 of the rooms. My main bedroom is cozy, and I've turned one of the others into a game room where I spend most of my free time. The other 2 rooms are at the far end of the upstairs hallway, and I rarely go near them. One of them has a few storage boxes, and the other is completely empty. After a late shift at work, I swung by Wendy's to grab some dinner. I was off the next day, so I planned to spend the night gaming without a care in the world. Once home, I settled into my usual routine, heading straight to the game room. I put on my headphones and booted up Call of Duty, ready for a long session. Just as I was about to jump into a match, I thought I heard a knock at the front door. I paused, took off my headset, and listened carefully. But when no other sounds followed, I shrugged it off, figuring that if someone was really there, they would have knocked again. 2 hours passed as I immersed myself in the game. Then, I heard it again. This time, it sounded more like a faint knock, or maybe a door closing. With my headset on and the game room door shut, it was hard to tell for sure, but the noise was just enough to pull me out of the game and leave me with a nagging sense of unease. I was already on edge when I sat back down, my mind playing tricks on me as I tried to shake off the uneasiness that had settled in. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside, made me jump. Still, I tried to focus on the game, telling myself I was being paranoid. But deep down, something didn't feel right. About 20 minutes later, just as I was finishing a round, I leaned back in my chair to relax. That's when I saw it. A figure, just at the edge of my vision, darting past the open doorway. My heart skipped a beat, and I ripped off my headphones, my pulse pounding in my ears. I stared at the doorway, frozen in fear. What I had seen, or thought I had seen, was gone in an instant. But the image of that dark shape burned into my mind. I stood there, paralyzed, for what felt like an eternity, every instinct screaming at me to run. But where, and from what? My rational mind fought to take control, convincing myself that it must have been a trick of the light, a shadow cast by something outside, or maybe I was just tired. But no matter how hard I tried to reason it away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Finally, I forced myself to move, stepping out into the hallway with shaky legs. The house was silent, save for the faint hum of the fridge downstairs and the creaking of the old floorboards beneath my feet. I began checking each room, starting with the ones closest to me. I flipped on lights, peered into closets, and looked under beds, but there was no sign of anyone. The air felt heavy. The kind of oppressive silence that makes you feel like you're being watched. When I made it downstairs, I saw the front door was unlocked again. My stomach dropped. I knew I had locked it after checking the first time. So how had it come undone? My hands were trembling as I relocked the door, triple-checking to make sure it was secure. I stood there for a long time, staring at the lock, trying to understand what was happening. Had someone been in my house this whole time, watching me, waiting for the right moment? Or was my mind playing tricks on me, unraveling after years of living alone? Either way, I knew one thing for sure. I was no longer safe in my own home. Panicked, I fumbled for my phone and called the police. My voice shook as I explained what had happened, the words tumbling out in a frantic rush. The dispatcher assured me they were sending officers right away, and those minutes waiting felt like an eternity. I paced back and forth, jumping at every little noise, my mind racing with horrifying possibilities. When the police finally arrived, they moved through the house with practiced efficiency, their flashlights cutting through the dark corners that suddenly seemed much more sinister. I followed them at a distance, clutching my arms around myself as if that could ward off the creeping dread that had taken root deep in my gut. It didn't take long for them to find the evidence. In the empty room at the end of the hall, the one I'd ignored for so long, they discovered a makeshift bed made out of old blankets and clothes, food wrappers scattered around, and a duffel bag stuffed with personal belongings. It was clear. Someone had been living there, right under my nose, for God knows how long. The realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. I hadn't set foot in that room for weeks, maybe even months. All this time, someone had been hiding just on the other side of the wall from where I slept, from where I lived my life, completely oblivious to the fact that I was sharing my home with a stranger. The police couldn't find the person. It seemed they had slipped away just before I noticed anything was wrong. The thought of what might have happened if I had confronted them, if they had decided to make themselves known in the dead of night, haunted me. My imagination conjured up all sorts of terrifying scenarios, each one worse than the last. In the days that followed, the house felt different, alien, almost. The place that had once been my sanctuary now felt tainted, its walls harboring secrets I could never fully understand. Every creak, every groan of the old wood now sent shivers down my spine, a constant reminder that I was never truly alone in the house. The thought of returning to normal, to pretending that everything was okay, seemed impossible. Sleep became elusive. Every shadow in the hallway, a potential threat, every noise, a sign that they had returned. The safety I once felt was gone, replaced by a deep, unshakable fear. The house, with all its familiar nooks and crannies, had betrayed me, keeping such a dark secret hidden away until it was almost too late. And now, no matter where I go, I can't shake the feeling that someone might still be watching, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. A little over a year ago, I was living in a quiet, suburban townhouse, reveling in the independence that came with having my own space at 24. It was everything I had imagined, peaceful, private, and entirely mine. But the silence could sometimes feel a bit too heavy, a constant reminder that I was alone. To chase away the loneliness, I made a habit of inviting my closest friends over as often as I could. Anna, in particular, was a regular visitor, often staying the night to escape the tension at her own house. On this particular evening, I didn't have any plans. It was one of those slow nights where the minutes seemed to stretch out forever. The only thing keeping me going was the thought of tomorrow, when Anna was supposed to come over for a movie night. The idea of a relaxing evening with a good friend was exactly what I needed. So I decided to turn in early, hoping that sleep would bring tomorrow a little faster. I crawled into bed around 9:15 p.m., the house enveloped in a comforting silence as I drifted off to sleep. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night, my heart pounding in my chest. My room was dark, the only light coming from the glowing digits of my alarm clock, which read 2 a.m. I couldn't figure out why I felt so on edge, like something was horribly wrong. I hadn't been dreaming, at least, not that I could remember, but my body was reacting as if I'd just woken up from a nightmare. I lay there for a moment, trying to steady my breathing, when a soft click from downstairs made my blood run cold. I froze, listening intently. The house was still, except for the faint creak of a door opening slowly, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps entering my home. My heart hammered against my ribs, and every instinct screamed at me to hide. But I forced myself to stay calm, convincing myself it had to be Anna or maybe another friend who'd come over unexpectedly. They all had keys for emergencies, after all. Maybe Anna had shown up early, needing a place to crash. Clinging to that thought, I slowly got out of bed, my legs trembling as I moved toward the bedroom door. I opened it cautiously, stepping into the hallway that now felt unnervingly dark and quiet. "Anna?" I called out, my voice barely more than a whisper. The silence that followed was suffocating, the kind that presses in on you from all sides, amplifying your fear. I stood there, waiting for any kind of response, but none came. The air felt thick, heavy with tension, and my nerves were stretched to their breaking point. Then, just as I was about to retreat back to my room, a bright light flickered on downstairs. It flooded the hallway with a harsh, unnatural glow, sending long, distorted shadows crawling up the walls. I could hear the soft murmur of the television coming from the living room, its low chatter eerily out of place in the dead of night. Relief washed over me briefly. I told myself it had to be one of my friends, probably too drunk to announce themselves properly. But as I stood there, my hand gripping the banister, something deep inside me whispered that this was wrong, that whoever was downstairs wasn't supposed to be here. Ignoring the icy dread creeping up my spine, I took a deep breath and started down the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The soft chatter from the TV grew louder with every step, the shadows on the walls twisting in the corner of my vision. When I finally reached the bottom, I turned the corner to look into the living room and froze in place. For a fleeting moment, relief washed over me, a comforting lie that it had to be one of my friends who had too much to drink and decided to crash at my place. But as I cautiously descended the stairs, the dim light from the TV guiding my steps, that false sense of security shattered into a paralyzing chill. Sitting casually on my couch, as if he belonged there, was a man I had never seen before. He looked about 50 years old, his hair long and patchy, his clothes dirty and tattered. The most terrifying part was how utterly unbothered he seemed by my presence. He didn't flinch, didn't move. He just glanced over at me with dark, hollow eyes, then curled his lips into a crooked, unsettling smile. Slowly he raised his hand and waved, like we were old friends, casually inviting me to join him on the couch. Panic erupted inside me, an instinctual, overwhelming need to get as far away as possible. Without thinking, I spun on my heels and bolted for the front door, my heart pounding in my ears so loudly that it drowned out everything else. I yanked the door open, nearly tripping over myself as I fled into the night. The cool air hit my face as I raced across the yard and banged on my neighbor's door, my fists slamming against the wood until they finally opened up and let me in. My neighbor's voice was a distant murmur as they called the police, my mind too clouded with fear to process anything. When the police arrived, I watched from the safety of my neighbor's window as they searched my house, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. But by the time they went inside, the man was long gone. No sign of him, no trace that he had ever been there at all. When the police finally came back out, their expressions were calm, almost dismissive. They suggested that it was likely just a harmless homeless man, probably just looking for a place to sleep. They assured me it wasn't anything to worry about, that he probably wouldn't come back. But I knew better. He had picked the lock on my door, made himself comfortable on my couch, and even turned on my TV. And then, as if mocking my fear, he had smiled at me, that twisted grin searing into my memory. I can't shake the feeling that he was more than just some random intruder. There was something calculated about the way he acted, as if he had been watching, waiting for the right moment to make himself known. Now, every night I'm alone, I lie awake, haunted by the image of that man on my couch. The darkness feels heavier, the silence more oppressive, because deep down, I fear that I'm never really alone. I keep waiting for the day when I'll hear that soft click of the door again, when I'll wake up to find him sitting there, waiting for me. And I know, if that day comes, I won't be able to run fast enough. My friend Samuel and I rented a house together a few months back. It was a decent place in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of spot where nothing much happens. Samuel, though, is the kind of guy who thrives on excitement. He's always out partying, staying out until the early hours, or crashing at other people's places. That left me with the house to myself more often than not, which I didn't really mind. Tonight was one of those nights. Samuel was out clubbing or whatever, so I decided to make the most of the solitude. I grabbed a couple of beers from the fridge and headed out to the front porch. The night was warm, a slight breeze rustling the leaves of the trees lining the street. It was nearly midnight, and the neighborhood was as silent as a graveyard. The only sounds were the occasional chirp of crickets and the distant hum of a car passing by. I settled into the old wooden swinging bench we'd set up on the porch, the gentle creak of the chains adding a soothing rhythm to the night. With each sip of beer, I felt myself relax, letting the calmness of the night wash over me. The silence, the stillness, it was exactly what I needed. After sitting on the porch for a little less than an hour, I noticed someone walking down the street. At first, I didn't think much of it. People occasionally took late-night strolls through the neighborhood. But as the figure drew closer, something about them felt off. They were big, with a hooded sweatshirt pulled low over their face, making it impossible to see their features. What really unnerved me, though, was the way they moved. Their legs were the only parts of their body that seemed to be working. The rest of them, shoulders, arms, even their head, stayed rigid and unmoving. It was like watching a puppet on strings. As they reached the stretch of road directly in front of my house, they stopped dead in their tracks. Slowly, they turned their head toward me. I could feel their gaze, even though I couldn't see their eyes. My heart began to pound, each beat growing louder in my ears. I waited, expecting them to say something, but they just stood there, staring. The silence between us stretched, heavy and oppressive. "Hey, buddy, you need something?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. The figure remained silent for a few moments longer, then without a word, started walking up my driveway. A wave of cold fear crashed over me as I realized this wasn't just some lost stranger. Something was very, very wrong. I shot up from the bench, my legs trembling beneath me. "Get out of here!" I shouted, but my voice cracked, betraying the fear gnawing at my insides. The figure didn't stop. They just kept coming, each step deliberate, methodical. When they were halfway up the driveway, I panicked, bolting inside and slamming the door behind me. My hands shook as I fumbled with the lock, finally twisting it into place. I pressed my eye to the peephole, breathless, watching as the figure came right up to the door. They stood there, still as a statue, for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, they reached under their sweatshirt and pulled something out. I strained to see through the tiny peephole, but the object was hard to make out. It looked like a hammer, or maybe a crowbar. Panic seized me. I knew what was coming. Without wasting another second, I dashed upstairs, slamming my bedroom door shut and locking it behind me. My fingers fumbled as I dialed 911, my voice barely a whisper, as I tried to explain the situation to the operator. Downstairs, I could hear the sharp crack of wood splintering as the man began breaking down the front door. I squeezed my eyes shut, pleading with the operator to hurry, my voice trembling with fear. Suddenly, there was a loud thud, followed by an eerie silence. The only sound left was the faint creak of the broken door swinging on its hinges. I held my breath, my mind racing with terrifying possibilities. Any moment now, I expected to hear his footsteps on the stairs, but the seconds stretched into agonizing minutes. The silence pressed in on me, thick and suffocating. I sat in the darkness of my bedroom, paralyzed with fear, waiting for the sound of footsteps on the stairs. Every second dragged on, stretching into what felt like hours, as I imagined him getting closer, his hand reaching for the doorknob, ready to break it down and finish what he had started. My heart pounded so hard that I could feel it in my throat, each beat echoing in the silence of the room. Then, just when I thought I couldn't take the suspense any longer, I heard the unmistakable sound of a cop car pulling into the driveway. Relief surged through me, but the operator on the phone kept her voice calm, urging me to stay where I was and wait for the police to come to me. I nodded even though she couldn't see me, forcing myself to stay put, even as every instinct screamed at me to run downstairs. About 30 seconds later, heavy footsteps pounded up the stairs. My breath caught in my throat as I heard an officer's voice shout out a command, followed by the sharp crackle of a taser. I stayed frozen, my heart still racing, until finally the cops called out, telling me it was safe to come out. I hesitated for a moment, then slowly unlocked the door and stepped into the hallway. The sight that greeted me was surreal. 2 officers stood there, one of them holding the taser, while the other knelt over the man who had broken into my house. He was slumped against the wall, his hood now fallen back to reveal a face that was eerily blank, almost as if he wasn't entirely there. The officer looked up at me and gestured for me to stay back. They explained that they had found him standing right outside my bedroom door, his hand raised as if he was about to knock or try the handle. It was like he had been waiting for me to open it, like he knew I was just on the other side. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. They cuffed him and took him away, but the whole thing was deeply unsettling. One of the officers told me The guy was drunk, but when they tried to get answers from him, who he was, why he had been walking down the road, why he chose my house, he just stayed silent. Even after sobering up, he refused to say anything, his eyes dull and empty. All I know is that if I had opened that door, it would have been the last thing I ever did. The memory of his figure, standing so still on the other side of that thin piece of wood, haunted me for weeks. Samuel eventually came back, completely oblivious to the horror that had unfolded while he was out. But I knew I'd never forget the terror of that night, or the feeling that something had chosen me for reasons I would never understand.